The moment I told you I would keep bringing you beneath the surface, I meant it, because what happened next in the story of Venezuelan oil is rooted in decades of willful blindness. For more than 40 years, Venezuela was treated by the global financial system as a permanent fixture, a country too rich in crude to ever truly collapse. Wall Street banks, European refiners, even US pension funds all built their forecasts on one quiet assumption that never made it into the headlines. Venezuela would always pump, no matter how unstable its politics became, no matter how hollowed out its institutions grew, the oil would keep flowing. That assumption created an illusion of inevitability, and illusions are the most dangerous things in geopolitics. How many warnings were ignored? How many balance sheets quietly bet against reality? When Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry in the early 2000s, the structural damage began. Skilled engineers were purged, replaced by loyalists. Maintenance budgets were gutted. Refineries that once rivaled the best in the world slowly decayed. But because oil prices were high and global demand was relentless, nobody wanted to see it. The pipelines still delivered. The tankers still sailed. On paper, everything looked fine. In practice, the system was rotting from the inside. By the time Nicolas Maduro inherited that machinery, it was already brittle. And when US sanctions started to bite after 2017, the collapse accelerated like a hairline fracture turning into a shattered window. This is where the technical machinery of power matters. When Washington moved to block Venezuela's access to the US financial system, it wasn't just symbolic. Every oil trade depends on letters of credit, insurance guarantees, shipping registries, and dollar clearing through American banks. By freezing those channels, the US didn't have to seize a single barrel. It made the oil economically radioactive. Traders who touched it risked losing their access to the global dollar system. Insurance firms who covered the tankers risked being blacklisted. Even ports that accepted the ships risked secondary sanctions. This is modern economic warfare, and it works not through bombs, but through paperwork. Who really controls the world now? Armies or accountants? The winners in this new order were never the Venezuelan people. They were the agile middlemen, the opaque trading houses that thrive in the shadows of sanctions. They bought oil at brutal discounts, flipped it through shell companies, and sold it into Asia at a profit. Meanwhile, American shell producers quietly gained market share, their barrels filling the gaps left by Caracas. The losers were long-term stability and every country that depended on predictable energy flows. Short-term profit trumped long-term security, and the system became more fragile with every workaround. But there is a dangerous obstacle lurking inside this strategy. When you force a nation out of formal markets, you push it into informal ones, and those are harder to control. Venezuela turned to China, to Russia, to networks that don't answer to Washington. Oil became a bargaining chip in a new alliance structure that weakens the very leverage sanctions were supposed to create. What happens when the dollar is no longer the only door? And while all of this plays out on trading screens, a supermarket clerk in Ohio watches the price of milk rise because fuel costs ripple through every delivery truck. A factory worker in Texas feels overtime disappear when energy contracts shift. These are the real shockwaves, not headlines, but household budgets. Globally, this pressure on Venezuelan oil has redrawn energy alliances. Europe scrambles for alternatives. Asia deepens ties with sanctioned states. The chessboard is shifting, piece by piece, toward a more divided world. So here is the moral question we cannot avoid. Should energy, the lifeblood of modern society, be wielded as a weapon without democratic accountability, or should citizens demand a system that values stability, transparency, and human dignity over strategic cruelty? Because in the end, power that is never questioned will always be abused. The fracture that was opened by that pressure did not stay contained inside Venezuela. It spread outward silently through a global system that had been trained for decades to believe that energy flows were apolitical, that the invisible hand of the market would always find a way. That belief was convenient. It allowed governments to outsource responsibility to traders and allowed traders to hide behind algorithms. But history tells us something very different. From the oil shocks of the 1970s to the wars of the Middle East, energy has always been political. The only thing that changed was how well the politics were hidden. For years, Washington pretended that sanctions were a surgical tool, precise and humane. In reality, they were blunt instruments, and Venezuela was only the latest body to feel their full weight. Why did nobody ask what would happen when a country that supplies millions of barrels a day is pushed off the grid? Who absorbs that shock? The technical heart of this crisis lies in the plumbing of global finance. Every barrel of oil is priced, hedged, and settled through a web of futures, contracts, shipping insurance, port fees, and dollar-denominated clearing systems. When Trump's administration escalated pressure, it wasn't only about stopping Venezuelan exports to the United States. It was about choking the pipes that allow oil to move anywhere. Banks were warned that even touching a Venezuelan transaction could cost them access to the US market. That is a death sentence for any global financial institution. As a result, refineries in India and Europe that still needed Venezuelan crude suddenly found themselves unable to pay for it, even if they wanted to. The oil was there, the ships were there, the money could not legally move. This is how power is exercised now, through the quiet terror of compliance departments. Who benefited? Large energy trading houses with complex offshore structures were able to step in, assuming risks that traditional banks could not. They profited from the chaos, arbitraging price gaps created by political force. Meanwhile, US producers and their investors saw rising demand for their barrels. It was a redistribution of market share disguised as a moral foreign policy, but long-term stability lost again. When supply chains become political weapons, every buyer pays a risk premium, and that premium shows up in higher prices for everyone. There is a fragile flaw in this architecture. It assumes that the dollar-based financial system will always be dominant. Yet by weaponizing it so openly, Washington encouraged its rivals to build alternatives. China expanded oil trading in yuan. Russia pushed for non-dollar settlements. Even smaller states began experimenting with barter and crypto-based trades. Each workaround chips away at the leverage that made sanctions effective in the first place. What happens when the tools of pressure lose their edge? On the ground, this translates into anxiety. A delivery driver in Atlanta sees gas eat up more of his paycheck. A family in Madrid cuts back on heating because energy costs are no longer predictable. These are not distant consequences, they are intimate. Geopolitically, the pressure on Venezuelan oil accelerated a realignment. Latin America grew wary of US dominance. Asia grew more intertwined with sanctioned states. The world did not become safer, it became more fragmented. And that leaves us with a stark ethical challenge. Is it acceptable to destabilize entire economies to achieve strategic goals without the consent of the people who will pay the price? Or should governance mean restraint, foresight, and respect for the social fabric that holds societies together? Because when power ignores those questions, it is never the powerful who suffer first. What makes this moment even more dangerous is that the damage is no longer confined to policy circles or trading floors. It has begun to harden into something structural, something that will outlive the administration that triggered it. For decades, the world built an energy system on the idea that oil would be traded like any other commodity, subject to supply and demand, not loyalty and punishment. That fiction allowed refineries in Texas, Rotterdam, and Shanghai to optimize for cost rather than politics. But the moment Venezuelan oil was turned into a geopolitical lever, that entire architecture cracked. The market did not adapt smoothly. It splintered. Why does that matter? Because fractured systems are easier to manipulate and harder to stabilize. The mechanics of this new reality are precise and ruthless. After the sanctions regime tightened, Venezuela began selling oil at steep discounts through opaque intermediaries. These traders used ship-to-ship transfers at sea, falsified origin documents, and complex webs of shell companies to mask the crude's origin. Meanwhile, US authorities used satellite tracking, port records, and financial surveillance to hunt those transactions. It became a cat-and-mouse game played across oceans and balance sheets. Each side refined its tactics, and each escalation made the trade more expensive, more secretive, and more volatile. Oil was no longer just fuel, it was contraband. In this shadow market a new class of winners emerged. Speculators, shipping brokers, and politically connected middlemen thrived. They could take risks that publicly listed companies could not. But the losers were far more numerous. Legitimate refiners lost reliable suppliers. Governments lost tax revenue. Consumers lost price stability. And Venezuela lost even more of the wealth it needed to rebuild. Short-term profits for a few replaced long-term resilience for the many. Is that a victory? There is a looming danger here that few policymakers are willing to acknowledge. When markets move underground, transparency disappears. That creates fertile ground for corruption, for criminal networks, even for the financing of violence. The harder the squeeze, the darker the trade becomes. At some point, the strategy stops weakening a regime and starts empowering forces no one can control. What happens when the cure becomes worse than the disease? Now imagine a grocery store in a small Midwestern town. The shelves are full, but prices keep creeping up. The clerk shrugs when asked why. It's shipping, it's fuel, it's always something. But behind that, something is a chain of decisions that started with sanction notices and executive orders thousands of miles away. A family choosing between heating and healthcare is paying for a geopolitical gamble they never voted on. Globally, this undergrounding of energy trade is reshaping alliances. Countries that once relied on transparent markets now hedge with secret deals. Trust erodes, and in that erosion, instability grows. So the deeper question remains: do we want a world where essential resources are governed by hidden deals and coercive power, or one where rules are clear and accountable? Because a system built on fear and force can never deliver the stability that real people need to live with dignity. The instability created by this new shadow system is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of decades of policy that treated energy as a tool of dominance rather than a shared foundation of modern life. For a long time, decision-makers in Washington believed they could fine-tune global behavior by turning financial dials, tightening sanctions here, loosening them there, confident that the rest of the world would simply adjust. Venezuela exposed the arrogance of that assumption. Its oil did not vanish. It just slipped beyond the reach of the rules that once governed it. And when rules lose their grip, power does not disappear. It mutates. Who benefits when everything becomes negotiable? The infrastructure that moves oil from wellhead to refinery is one of the most complex systems humans have ever built. Pipelines, ports, tankers, insurance markets and futures exchanges all rely on trust. Trust that a contract will be honored. Trust that a shipment is what it claims to be. Trust that a payment will clear. Sanctions shattered that trust. Suddenly, every document was suspect. Every cargo potentially toxic. Companies began to demand higher premiums, longer delays, more guarantees. Those costs did not stay in corporate ledgers. They flowed downstream into the price you and I pay for energy and everything. Energy touches. The immediate winners were those who could navigate uncertainty. Hedge funds that bet on volatility. Trading houses that specialized in distressed cargoes. Even some state actors that leveraged their political alignment to secure cheap oil. But the long-term losers were everyone who depends on a predictable world, which is to say, all of us. Economies cannot plan when energy becomes a gamble. Investments stall. Jobs evaporate. Is this really how a stable global order is supposed to function? There is also a growing backlash that threatens to derail the entire strategy. Nations that feel targeted by unilateral sanctions are banding together, sharing technology, financing, and political cover. What began as pressure on one country is morphing into a broader resistance to US financial dominance. The more aggressively Washington uses its tools, the more incentive others have to build alternatives. That is not speculation. It is already happening. Meanwhile, a teacher in California watches her utility bill, buys and wonders how to stretch her salary a little further. A small business owner delays hiring because shipping costs are unpredictable. These are not abstract consequences of foreign policy. They are intimate, daily stresses that erode trust in institutions. On the global stage, the Venezuelan oil standoff has become a case study for every nation that fears being next. It has taught them that access to markets can be revoked, that contracts can be nullified by politics. That lesson changes how they behave, how they align, how they prepare for the future. So we come back to governance. Power that is exercised without regard for its ripple effects ultimately weakens the very system it seeks to control. Citizens deserve leaders who understand that economic warfare is still warfare, with casualties measured in lost livelihoods and broken stability. The question is not whether pressure works in the short term. The question is whether it leaves a world worth living in afterward. What is most unsettling about this moment is how normalized all of this has become. A decade ago, the idea that entire energy sectors could be switched on and off by executive order would have triggered global alarm. Now it barely registers as background noise. We have been trained to accept economic shock as the cost of doing politics. Venezuela's oil, once a pillar of hemispheric stability, has become a warning flare, signaling how far that normalization has gone. When did we decide that volatility was an acceptable form of governance? The architecture that made this possible was built quietly over years. After the financial crisis of 2008, US regulators tightened their grip on global banking. New rules gave Washington unprecedented visibility into cross-border payments. Every dollar transaction, even between two foreign firms, had to touch the American financial system somewhere. That gave the US a kind of economic omniscience. With that came temptation. By the time Trump's team escalated pressure on Venezuela, the machinery was already in place to enforce compliance on a planetary scale. Oil did not need to be seized, its money did. In the short term, this produced what looked like success. Venezuela's state oil company was starved of cash. Government revenue collapsed. Political pressure mounted. But the longer-term effects were far more corrosive. By forcing energy trade into legal grey zones, the sanctions hollowed out legitimate institutions and rewarded those willing to operate without transparency. That is a recipe for systemic decay. The very networks that keep global commerce honest were undermined in the name of control. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Some of the same corporations that publicly applauded the sanctions privately adapted to them. They restructured subsidiaries, they rerouted cargoes, they found ways to profit from the new scarcity. In public, they spoke the language of ethics. In private, they optimized for revenue. Stability was nobody's top priority. There is a growing risk that this brittle system will break in ways no one can contain. A shipping accident, a misidentified tanker, a retaliatory embargo. When trust is low and stakes are high, small errors can cascade into major crises. Are we prepared for that? Think of a retiree on a fixed income, watching the cost of heating rise while her savings earn almost nothing. Or a young couple delaying buying a home because energy costs make their future uncertain. These are the quiet casualties of geopolitical brinkmanship. Around the world, governments are taking notes. They are learning that reliance on any single financial or energy hub is a vulnerability. That realization is accelerating a shift toward regional blocks and alternative systems. The global economy is becoming less integrated, more fragmented, more fragile, and that is the deepest moral failure here. True leadership should build resilience, not brittleness. It should protect the social fabric, not gamble with it. Citizens deserve a form of power that is exercised with humility and foresight, not one that treats the world as a chessboard and people as expendable pieces. The future of governance depends on whether we demand better. What comes next may be the most revealing chapter of all, because it exposes how deeply the logic of pressure has embedded itself into modern power. Once a nation like Venezuela is pushed into the margins of the global economy, it does not simply wait to be rescued. It adapts, it learns, it finds new patrons and new pathways. In doing so, it reshapes the world around it. That is the paradox no strategist wants to confront. The harder you squeeze, the more creative the resistance becomes. How long before that resistance stops being manageable? Over time, Venezuelan oil began flowing through new corridors that Washington could not easily police. Blended with other crudes, rebranded through third countries, paid for in currencies outside the dollar system, it quietly found its way back into global circulation. The market did not collapse, it mutated, and each mutation weakened the old structures that had once made global trade predictable. For the first time in decades, a significant volume of energy was moving beyond the reach of the institutions designed to regulate it. This created an uneven playing field. Companies that followed the rules were locked out, Those willing to bend them gained access to cheaper supply. That distorted competition, undermined trust, and rewarded risk taking over responsibility. It also planted the seeds for future crises. When accountability disappears, so does stability. There is also a political cost that rarely makes it into policy memos. Populations in sanctioned and sanctioning countries alike grow cynical. They see prices rise. They see elites maneuver. They feel powerless. That erosion of faith is not a side effect. It is a direct consequence of governing through economic coercion rather than democratic consent. What happens to a society when people stop believing that rules are fair? Picture a dock worker in a European port, watching ships arrive with cargoes that have traveled halfway around the world through labyrinths of intermediaries just to avoid a political barrier. Each extra mile, each extra handoff adds cost. He knows it. His paycheck depends on it. So does yours. On the geopolitical stage, Venezuela's survival through these shadow networks has become a blueprint. Other countries under pressure are studying it, refining it, preparing to use it. The result is a world where power is more diffuse, less transparent, and far harder to regulate. That might sound like freedom. In practice, it is chaos. So the question we must ask is not whether Trump's pressure on Venezuelan oil was bold. It was. The question is whether it was wise. True governance is not about proving you can bend the world to your will. It is about building systems that endure without constant force. A society that accepts perpetual economic warfare as normal will eventually find itself living in a permanent state of insecurity. And that is not strength. That is fragility wearing the mask of power. The final truth that emerges from all of this is uncomfortable because it points not to a single villain or a single policy, but to a culture of power that has lost its sense of proportion. What began as pressure on a distant oil producer has evolved into a global stress test for the entire economic order. The Venezuelan case showed just how easily the levers of finance and trade can be turned into weapons, and how quickly those weapons can slip out of their wielder's control. When that happens, who pays the price? We are now living in a world where volatility is no longer an anomaly. It is engineered. Every sanction, every countermeasure, every workaround adds another layer of unpredictability. Markets become more nervous, companies become more defensive, governments become more suspicious. This is not a recipe for prosperity. It is a slow march toward fragmentation. And yet, there is a strange complacency in how this is all discussed. Politicians talk about leverage. Analysts talk about strategic gains. Very few talk about the social cost. But that cost is real and it is cumulative. It shows up in wages that do not keep up with prices, in pensions that lose value, in young people who feel their future narrowing. These are the silent indicators of a system under strain. There is also a deeper risk that no one can sanction away. When trust in institutions collapses, people turn to extremes. They look for simple answers in a complex world. That is how instability becomes political, energy shocks become social shocks, and social shocks become democratic crises. The Venezuelan oil confrontation has taught the world something essential. Power without restraint creates its own enemies. It pushes nations to build parallel systems, to seek shelter in alliances of convenience, to undermine the very frameworks that once kept conflict in check. That may serve short-term objectives. It destroys long-term order. So here we are, standing at the edge of a new kind of global economy, one that is less transparent, less predictable, and less forgiving. We did not arrive here by accident. We arrived here through choices. The moral burden of those choices belongs to leaders, but the consequences belong to all of us. A worker deserves to know that his paycheck will not be erased by a distant political gamble. A family deserves to know that the lights will stay on at a price they can afford. A society deserves governance that values stability over spectacle. The question is whether we will demand that kind of leadership, or whether we will continue to accept a world where power is exercised without accountability, and where the hidden costs are always paid by the people who had the least say in the first place. What makes this final stage so critical is that it forces us to confront the long shadow of what has already been done. By the time pressure on Venezuelan oil reached its peak, the world was no longer dealing with a single crisis, but with a transformed system. Markets had learned to live with distortion. Governments had learned to live with retaliation. And citizens had learned quietly to live with uncertainty. That is how instability becomes normalized. That is how extraordinary stages become routine. And once that happens, it is almost impossible to go back. Who decides when the emergency is over? Venezuela itself became a mirror held up to the global order. A country with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth was reduced to bartering its wealth through shadow channels, not because the oil disappeared, but because access to the rules-based system was revoked. That should terrify anyone who believes in fair markets, because if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. The message was clear: resources do not belong to those who have them. They belong to those who control the system that moves them. The deeper tragedy is that none of this was inevitable. There were paths that could have preserved pressure on corruption and authoritarianism without detonating the foundations of global trade. There were diplomatic off-ramps that could have reduced suffering instead of amplifying it. But they required patience, compromise, and an acceptance that power is strongest when it is constrained by principle. That is not the instinct of modern politics. Look at the world now. Energy flows are more fragmented, alliances are more brittle, financial systems are more politicized. Every major economy is hedging against disruption instead of investing in cooperation. That is the legacy of treating oil as a weapon rather than a public good. And again, the human cost is the quietest and the heaviest. A retiree calculating whether she can afford another winter. A young worker wondering if his job will still exist when the next shock hits. These are the people who carry the weight of decisions made in rooms they will never enter. So this is where the story truly ends, not with a policy victory or a market rebound, but with a choice about what kind of world we want to inhabit. One where power is exercised through fear and financial chokeholds, or one where it is exercised through cooperation, transparency, and respect for the lives it touches. Citizens do not deserve to be collateral damage in geopolitical experiments. They deserve a system that treats stability as a right, not a bargaining chip. And until we demand that, the shocks will keep coming, each one harder to absorb than the last.